Hey everyone, my name's Stephanie Kulesza. I'm the Nutrient Management and Animal Waste Specialist in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences. And I was involved in a team that came out to collect some soil samples from farms that were impacted in Western North Carolina. And I've been asked to talk today about some of the things that we've seen regarding the heavy metal analysis, and talk about, ways that we have recommending reducing risk when it comes to heavy metals. So first off, when we came out to visit, we put together a set of just general recommendations depending on the site conditions and what specifically happened in that area. And we really focused on flooded areas because we knew that there was a lot of relocation of sediments. There was a lot of potential for contaminants to either come onto sites or to leave sites. And so we wanted to really hone in on the flooded areas, and it became very apparent that those fell into two specific scenarios typically. One is flooding that resulted in severe erosion. And our recommendations for that were to submit a sample for general fertility at a minimum, because loss of topsoil will result in needing to build back up that fertility to make sure that we can return to crop production. Additionally, with the loss of topsoil, we might need to bring in topsoil or add organic amendments to help build back our soils and start rebuilding those soils for crop production. Another thing we saw was flooding with various levels of deposition. And a lot of times this was pretty extreme deposition. And so our recommendations were to test the sediments for a variety of things, conduct land leveling to try to level out the depth of those sediments that were deposited evenly across the landscape. So in some areas, especially if you were right next to a creek, you might have had 3 or 4 feet of sediment right next to the creek versus it got down to about 6 inches at the edge of the flood waters. And so with that much variety, we can see a lot of issues arise when it comes to crop production because you're changing the entire soil profile across the entire field. And so if we're able to spread that across the entire area and maybe have an average of 1 foot over the entire field, it helps us even out and not have hot spots or bad spots in the field or at the edge of the field where those sands and sediments are deepest. And so land leveling was emphasized, as well as tillage. If you're able to mix these sediments into the soils, that can be very helpful, but also tillage just in the immediate aftermath to reduce bacterial contamination. So those testing recommendations that we had these 3 different primary or immediate testing recommendations that we put together. One was general fertility. Like I said, we've either brought in sediments that generally have low fertility, or we've lost our topsoil. And so understanding the fertility was going to be extremely important for all of these areas. And so general fertility is recommended regardless of the level of impact that you've seen on your farm. The next one was heavy metals. So with so much movement and so much, such an intense flood situation, there is a chance of having contamination and movement of different contaminants within the watershed and within the region. And so heavy metals and bacteria both can be things that are brought onto the farm through that flooding. And so those are our 2 primary tests in addition to general fertility that we recommended. And then secondary were other potential organic contaminants, such as volatile organic compounds from like petroleum products, pesticides, things like that. Because those were so expensive, it was, we weren't able to conduct any testing in that except for in a couple very unique situations. And so today I'm really just going to be focusing again on the heavy metals aspect. And specifically, I'm not a soil chemist. I'm not a heavy metals expert. Like I said, I'm a manure management specialist. And so I've learned a lot over the last couple months about heavy metals through conversations with EPA and conversations with colleagues within our department. And so I'm going to present some of the information that we've collected and gathered. And then also I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen in some of the samples, and then what you can do if you have concerns about heavy metals on your own farm. And so for the purpose of today, we're really going to be focusing on arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead. And so if you want to know about our initial recommendations regarding this flooding situation and what to do immediately after a flood, we did put out a fact sheet with all of these recommendations. And within that, we also have a section on heavy metals. And so in talks with EPA and in talks with colleagues who are more closely aligned with heavy metal research in our department, we came up with a list of potential heavy metals that you would want to analyze for if you had concerns on your property. And so primarily, the four big ones that we identified were arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead. We also have a list of secondary heavy metals that include copper, cobalt, nickel, antimony, selenium, vanadium, and zinc. A couple of these are more of a plant health concern. So copper and zinc can be found in industry. It also can be found in manures and biosolids. So and also galvanized roofing. So there's several different ways that it could actually get on your property. But the thing about those is they can cause crop toxicity. So that's the main reason why we added those to the list, is because it actually is really important to understand whether you have that, because it can affect different crops and cause yield reduction. So those two are also included on your soil test report. And so a general fertility sample would show you whether you have an issue there. So if you're sending samples out, you don't necessarily need to send them out for copper and zinc as well. The four main ones would be arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead. So what do we do about heavy metals? There's a lot of different options when it comes to severely impacted and severely contaminated sites. And generally, when we talk about heavy metals within either a garden setting or within a agricultural setting, we're not looking at a Superfund site. We're looking at a site that might have elevated heavy metals. And generally what we're talking about are the most cost-effective options. And the two most cost-effective are ways to improve natural attenuation and phytoremediation, which is pulling crops off, harvesting crops off of a contaminated site, and drawing down the heavy metals over time. And so these are the two typically most cost-effective options. There's a whole lot of other ones that are much more expensive, but for the sake of many of these situations, if you were to see elevated concentrations, we're talking about, options and remediation strategies that would fall into these two categories most of the time. And so when it comes to the recommendations and what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to focus on two fact sheets. One is from Duke University. Their Superfund Research Center put out a really nice set of fact sheets on different potential contaminants. And it also has ranges and things you can do to minimize your risk associated with exposure to those contaminants. Another one is a fact sheet out of NC State called Minimizing Risks of Soil Contaminants in Urban Gardens. This also has a nice long list of ways to minimize your risk of exposure. And so I'm going to be drawing from both of these today when I talk about each one of these metals. So now what we're going to talk about is we're going to dive into each one of these individually. So when it comes to arsenic, these are pulled directly from that Duke set of fact sheets. So as far as the average background level of arsenic in North Carolina, 4 ppm or parts per million, which is equivalent to milligrams per kilogram. So if you see a soil test report, your soil test report will likely say either parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. The ones that I've seen and I've sent in are reported as parts per million, but remember that these are equivalent. So if you see a soil test come back with a 4 milligrams per kilogram, that is equivalent to 4 parts per million that's shown in this chart. Now, this 4 parts per million would be considered lower risk. And we can see that there are regions where you would, step up to a moderate risk and a higher risk. So out of the samples that we've pulled in Western North Carolina, the vast majority have fallen within the lower risk into the moderate risk. I think we've only had one sample that was in right at that threshold between moderate risk and higher risk. And arsenic is one of those that's a little bit unique and can be found in areas that you might not expect. A couple common sources of arsenic are herbicides and pesticides. Arsenic was a common one in orchards. So if you're living on a property that was an old orchard, you might already have some elevated levels of arsenic in your soils because it's a common or was a common pesticide. Additionally, it was also used in poultry production as a pesticide to help with bird health. It is no longer used, though, in poultry production. So while this says try to not use commercial, this fact sheet says try not to use commercial poultry litter, arsenic is not a source, or poultry litter is not a source of arsenic any longer. That stopped about 10 years ago. However, if you do see elevated levels really of any of these metals, it would be prudent to test your well water for heavy metals as well. To know your risk and know what actually is in your well water, if you're consuming well water, it would be a good idea to have that tested. It's recommended to test once a year anyways, but if you haven't done it and you see some higher levels of metals in your soils, it would be a good idea to go ahead and get your well water tested as well. Arsenic can come from treated wood. So railroad ties are a very common option for edges to a garden bed. So trying to switch those out for natural options. We have a lot of down logs right now. So maybe using some logs to create the edges of your beds would be maybe a better idea. Adding compost or increasing your organic matter is almost always a good way to reduce the bioavailability of metals in your soils. And so by increasing the organic matter, you're increasing what's called the cation exchange capacity. And there's a lot of complexion sites where you can tie up all sorts of things, including metals. And so by increasing your organic matter, you can reduce the amount that is available for the plants to take up. Additionally, a lot of times when we're talking about metals, raising the pH can be beneficial as well. Now in this, it says aim for a neutral soil pH around 7. That's not really possible for a lot of crops. It's too high. I would say if you can keep your pH around 6.2, you'll be doing a service to yourself as far as reducing uptake. It might not be, locking up as much as possible, but if you get your pH too high, you can actually cause micronutrient deficiencies of like manganese. And so we don't want to have our soil pH that high unless you're growing a crop that is actually accustomed to having that high of a pH. The real thing is try to keep your pH around 6.2. Don't let it get down in the 5s. Try to keep it above 6 and try to keep it around 6.2. And that'll help you in reducing the bioavailability to an extent. It might, it might not be the best, but it will help some. And then there are several ways that we can reduce our exposure by just not coming in contact with as much soil. And so washing our produce, washing our hands, taking off our shoes before we enter the house, those are all great strategies to reduce our exposure if we have soils that have arsenic or any metal in them. Now, as far as cadmium, we can see that our ranges change depending on the metal. So metals have different forms that they're in, but they also have different levels at which we might be concerned. And so for cadmium, the average is about 0.16 in North Carolina. And I've seen an average generated as high as 0.3. So somewhere in the 0.15 to 0.3 is about the average for North Carolina. And all of the soils that we have analyzed from Western North Carolina have been below this 2.5 parts per million recommendation. However, we have seen some that are between 1.5 and 2. And the threshold that we put within the fact sheet that I showed at the very beginning was 1.5. And we had discussions about whether to put it at 1.5 or 2. And really why we built that is in case a person wanted to submit a sample, we wanted to give them some criteria at which they should reach out to us. And so if you do have it over 1.5, I just recommend reaching out to somebody just to talk about minimizing your risks and potential additional testing to see whether we can reduce the potential for your exposure. Again, adding compost or other organic matter is going to help in reducing bioavailability. Now, compost isn't the only way to increase your organic matter. We can see organic matter raised through a variety of techniques. So no-till management, cover cropping, adding compost, all of these things can help us increase our organic matter. Additionally, if you had a minimum amount of sediment, so say 4 to 6 inches of sediment was deposited on the surface of your soil, just tilling that and mixing it into your existing soil can help add some organic matter to those sediments, because that soil that's underneath those sediments that were deposited has some organic matter there. And so that, even though tillage might seem like maybe it wouldn't be the right thing to do, in this situation, it actually can add organic matter because these sediments have essentially no organic matter in them. Unless it was a siltier deposit, you're not going to see organic matter in sands and coarse sands and gravels. So mixing that into your soil, those coarse sands especially, is going to help you add organic matter because it's going to thoroughly mix it with the soil that's underlying those sediments. Again, liming to raise your soil pH. Again, trying to keep it around that 6.2 is going to help you in minimizing your availability of cadmium. Cadmium is primarily your main route of exposure is going to be through ingesting soil. So trying to wash produce as thoroughly as possible, trying to remove your boots before you enter the house, washing your hands or wearing gloves when you're working into the garden. Again, these are going to be helpful ways to reduce your potential exposure. If you have high soil cadmium, some plants are better than others. So in this instance, planting leafy greens in an area with lower levels of cadmium would be preferential. If you are concerned, again, bringing in soil that you have tested and you know is low in cadmium would be another alternative. Mercury. So the average background for mercury in North Carolina is 0.06 parts per million. And 1.6 parts per million is the identified threshold for a low risk. And all of ours have been below this 1.6 threshold. We haven't seen any soil samples that we would be concerned of with mercury or lead. But if you do, that doesn't say that they're not out there. It's just, the samples that we've collected have not shown that as an issue. And so uptake of mercury by plants is low. So dust is your biggest thing. Again, coming into contact with the soil and ingestion of soil, those are the things we want to minimize. So if you can remove your boots and shoes, wash your hands, wear gloves, you're getting a theme here. These are all ways to reduce your exposure risk. Now, it says that flooded soils may help convert mercury to its more toxic form. the emphasis here is on, but this can take many months. And so you might be thinking, oh, this was a flooded situation. Well, it was a very fast flooded situation. And so because it was so fast, I don't want you to think that mercury is going to be in its toxic form because it came from a flood. It really does take some time for it to convert into its more toxic form. Again, adding compost or other organic matter through those other means we talked about would be a way to reduce bioavailability. And then just making sure, trying to reduce our exposure through all the ways we've talked about thus far. Lead is one of those that we hear more about probably in our day-to-day lives, just because of the potential for exposure in particularly urban settings. And so the average background for North Carolina is around 21.3 parts per million. The average for urban soils is around 150 parts per million, but that can vary widely depending on where you are and what sources of lead are in that area. Think lead paint. The risk is going to be higher if you live in an older subdivision where lead paint was used on the housing. So we have not seen any lead above this 150 parts per million. However, again, that doesn't mean that they're not out there, but we haven't seen it in the samples that we have submitted from that region. Again, I know I'm maybe beating a dead horse here and saying the same things over and over, but the same theories apply to a lot of these. Adding compost is going to reduce your bioavailability, improving and increasing the pH, keeping it around optimum for crop production is going to reduce bioavailability. And then trying to keep yourself protected from consuming or ingesting dust or soil from the produce that you're harvesting is a way to reduce your potential for contamination. Another thing which pops out here is peeling produce is another acceptable option. So that brings us to our long list, and this is the comprehensive list that was in that NC State fact sheet on contaminants in urban gardens and how to thoroughly protect yourself. This is a list that provides a lot of different options. So you'll see that a lot of these we've already talked about: wearing gloves or washing your hands, removing your shoes, keeping children from ingesting soil, washing your produce really well, or removing the outer leaves that might have more dust or soil attached to them, peeling root vegetables. Plant tissue testing is one that can be a little bit misleading. Plants will have different levels of all nutrients, including metals, based on how well they're growing and when you harvest that tissue sample. So if you grow a vegetable or a row crop, you might have a tissue test that you normally submit for nitrogen or for phosphorus or to see the status of the crop. Well, there are very specific thresholds that were developed through hundreds of site years of data collection to get you that threshold of what's optimum in your plant. A lot of specialty crops, a lot of uncommon crops, we might not have information for heavy metals specifically in those tests or for those crops. And actually you can see big differences based on the environmental conditions. So this is something that I see a lot in corn. If I go out and test the nitrogen in my corn in the ear leaf and it's a bad drought, the drought is what's affecting the crop, not the nutrient status. And so you can see different nutrient levels and it have nothing to do with the nutrients in your soil. The same thing is for metals as well. So tissue testing or testing of the produce can be something that you do, but you have to take that into account with the holistic assessment of what's going on, because environmental factors can play a big role in that as well. If you have contamination and you do more intensive soil sampling to identify exactly where the contamination is located, you can then grow your more sensitive or risky crops such as leafy greens or tubers in areas with lower metals. Or again, you could bring a raised bed in bring soil in that has that you've tested and has no or low metals, and grow your higher risk vegetables in that raised bed situation. So there are ways to work around this and minimize your exposure. You've got options. It's really just understanding what's there to begin with. And then again, your plant selection can play a part. The root crops, you can, those might be higher risk because soil can be attached to them. So one, making sure that you wash them thoroughly. You could peel them to reduce some of the risk to make sure that you get all of the soil off of there. Or again, raise them in areas where you have lower soil contamination. Leafy crops, you can wash those very thoroughly or grow those in lower areas. And then fruit bearing crops tend to have lower contaminant concentrations. Liming and organic matter are those two primary methods of reducing bioavailability. So those are two options that we've discussed thoroughly. There are other options. We talked about how there can be very intensive options, and a lot of those are focused on very contaminated areas. So really, this is something that is kind of a last resort, or an area where you have an extreme situation. We haven't seen anything like that in any of the soils that we've collected. And what I would recommend is really doing a cost comparison. What is the scope of the issue? What is the level of contamination? Because removing or decontamination of soil can be extremely expensive. So if we're talking about a garden situation, it might be much cheaper to cover the soil with mulch, install raised beds, and bring in a soil that you've tested versus trying to remove the soil from the entire area. And so understanding that there are other options, but they're likely the most expensive options. And so you likely have options that are more cost effective, depending on the scale of the contamination. And so just some final thoughts. We are here to help. We have some, resources, albeit a bit limited, to help with heavy metal testing. If you are concerned about heavy metals in your soils, feel free to reach out to your extension agent, and they can get into contact with me, and we can arrange to see whether we can cover some of the cost of analysis or help interpret some of the analyses. So again, we had that table where we would recommend reaching out just to get some additional eyes on that soil test result. If you have levels of concern, and we can talk about, thoroughly talk about your options for reducing your risk of exposure if you do have levels that you're concerned about. With that, thank you for your time, and we're happy to answer any questions if there are any. This is my email address. Feel free to reach out if you want to discuss anything further.
Thank you, Steph. Does anybody have any questions for Steph?
I just have one quick question, Steph. So you mentioned in the results that we've captured thus far, there's been very isolated incidents of concern to no concern based on what we've collected. But if someone did want to test for heavy metals or one of these other contaminants, where should they go?
That's a great question, because not all labs are equivalent in their testing methods. That's been our biggest challenge thus far. The gold standard for analysis of heavy metals is getting a total metal analysis for those heavy metals. We have been sending samples out because we don't have the capacity to do that in-house. And so we've been sending them to a private lab. The soil samples that we've been sending out have been going to Waters Lab. You could look for other labs and just confirm that they are testing for total metals. If they say they're testing for Malic 3, that is not total metals. And so what we really want to do is analyze for total metals. So it's really important to send it to a lab that can do that. As far as sample collection, what I would recommend is dependent on the situation. So if you have a really intensive sediment deposition where you maybe have 3 to 4 feet, and you don't intend to move that off site, I would take a sample from as deep as you can probe, thoroughly mix that and submit that for analysis, because we want to capture what is in that entire profile. A lot of crops, you know, we sample in the top 8 inches for a lot of our fertility, but a lot of crops go deeper than that. And so, you know, we've been recommending, if we have really deep sediment deposition, that we take a representative sample of that entire amount of sediment. Now, if you don't have the capability to do that, then just send in a general fertility sample, and request a heavy metal analysis. Now, again, make sure that it is total heavy metals. So NCDA does not do total heavy metals. They do Malic 3, because that's what's required for people who have to do that analysis from a regulatory standpoint. But that's not what we want to do in this specific situation. We want to do total heavy metals. That's a good question.
Steph, I have a quick question. So there are some
Mm-hmm.
growers that didn't test ahead of time, right? And they've already gotten heavy equipment in, they've moved a bunch of soil around, and they had sediment built up, and they're tilling, they're rebuilding. Would you recommend, after they've done this work, to go through and do a soil sample, sort of a like we do for fertility, you know, it would be subsampling all over the place and then sending that in for total heavy metal?
I think
just
that
to
would be
make sure-
very appropriate.
Okay.
Yeah. I think if you had any sort of deposition on your farm, it would be a good idea to go ahead, even if you've already tilled or had land leveling equipment, or, you know, moved a lot of sediments. It still would be a good idea just to have that assurance, for yourself. Now, a caveat that I didn't mention is, we've taken these samples, but we don't know what was there before. And so I'm not saying that the samples that had higher levels of arsenic or that had moderate levels of cadmium, that is, you know, from somewhere else and moved on site. This could be a regional thing. We know that there's some arsenic in North Carolina, some areas of higher arsenic in North Carolina. So some of this could be natural. Again, some of it could be from historical pesticide application. And so some of it might have been there before the flood. But after the flood, it would be prudent to know what is there. And so I would recommend sending in a sample just to understand your risk. And understand the risk to your crops or whatever you're growing, and understanding the potential for or ways that you can minimize your risk. And again, if you see moderate levels, you'd also want to test your water. So, you know, there's several aspects to this where if you did have historical metals there and you didn't know about it, and, you know, you'd also want to know what's in your water as well. So I would encourage both of those. Test the soil first, especially. If you see anything of concern, then would definitely recommend testing for metals in your water as well. Any other questions?
I don't think so. Thank you, Steph. I'll end the recording now.
Great.